purpose of what we're doing here tonight is to give you a little bit of a background into what our players are going to be experiencing week to week. I felt that it was important for us to have a little conversation about that because I will bet that most of you are used to Faerun, or maybe one of the other settings, but I'm not sure how many of you have spent any grand amount of time outside of Faerun, and I have no idea how many of you actually frequent Eberron. The setting itself was created back in, I believe, 2003? Might have been 2008. That also could have been 4th edition. But the majority of the setting has existed since 3rd edition, 3.5, and 4th, and we have yet to see an update for 5th edition. Luckily, I'm friends with Keith Baker, who is the creator of the setting, and on our previous romps through Eberron, where Maze Arcana's humble beginnings started, we had his assistance in updating the setting. For any of you guys that know me or Satine, you know that we actually do a fair bit of writing with D&D, and also we've got some experience in mechanics. So between the three of us, we've been able to pretty much put together anything that we've needed to this point. One thing that I felt would help without everybody having to go back and read all of the other books, because there's quite a few, would be if Keith and I kind of sat down and had a conversation about some of the most common questions, I think, that Eberron elicits. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hop right into our little Eberron deep dive. The first thing for me to consider when thinking about Eberron is really what opportunities are going to be available here that aren't available elsewhere. In some ways, this is answered in the 10 Things You Need to Know section of Eberron, in the Eberron campaign setting guidebook. That was a 3rd edition book, and you can find it on the DM's Guild if you actually wanted to go through and read it all, and I think it's a pretty good read. But the most important things to know about Eberron, and what really makes it different from Faerun, is that it was designed with the ideas that the PCs are actually the heart of whatever campaign or story, instead of just merely casual passerbys that happen to accrue power just like every other peasant. The world really has no safety net, and what I mean by that is there's no Elminster, and there aren't gods that are going to step in and intervene. Sure, there's faith and religion, but you're not going to see Behemoth come down and hang out with somebody, or, you're not going to have some general level 20 character just pop up and save the day if your party can't. Most of the creatures most of the NPCs in the world are never going to amass a grand amount of power, and they're all limited in some way. Jayla Darren loses her power if she leaves Flame Keep. She's the closest thing that they have to somebody with a direct connection to a deity, that being the Silver Flame. The dragons of Arganessen might act to save the world, but they might not think twice if they end up leveling Corvair, the main continent and where our campaign will be set. They might not think twice if they level it in the process. The Eberron campaign doesn't have to involve epic threats. It can be your standard day-to-day stuff. But if it does, there's really nobody else that can fix it except you. Eberron likes to explore the idea that magic can become technology. I'm sure it was a little bit of a magic or a little voodoo for Ben Franklin to pull electricity out of the sky. But what happens when we can conjure it? What happens to our civilization when that happens? Despite the places where your imagination can just go right off of that idea, The world doesn't necessarily need to have access to copious amounts of high-level magic. In fact, very few of the NPCs do. Eberron is a low magic and wide magic setting as opposed to a high magic setting. High meaning, well, high basically being favorite. The stuff that you commonly see in most of D&D. And that means that there's probably not a whole lot of people walking around with anything higher than maybe third-ish level spells, and those are going to be exceedingly rare. The use of wide magic creates a lot of story opportunities that don't really exist in other settings, especially when you couple it with that low magic that's available. There was a conflict on an epic scale. That conflict is called the Last War. Think of it a little bit like World War I, and the era that we're in is the little bit of tenuous peace before World War II kicked off. That's not necessarily something that has to happen, but it probably wouldn't surprise very many of the inhabitants if war did break out. So when you're kind of feeling out this setting, keep in mind that we are talking about the noir feelings, the noir je ne sais quoi that you would have had between, right? That's funny. I just made people behind the camera laugh, so forgive the break of the fourth wall. You might kind of have that feeling between World War I and World War II, the 30s and 40s leading up into something so grand a conflict, and because of that, a lot of the countries are on edge. So there's a profound impact of that war on this setting, and it can provide quite a few hooks for both characters and NPCs and an audience. Eberron's approach to the divine is different than every other D&D setting. I mentioned a minute ago that there's not really deities that are just going to be around hanging out. But that doesn't mean that we can't explore what faith is. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We can really delve into what corruption within a church means. We can explore the stories that kind of revolve around heresy or schisms that would cripple another setting. Because, well, that god would just basically come down and smite whatever character was acting all heretical. Perhaps a perfectly devout NPC, perhaps there's a perfectly devout PC that begins to lose their divine magic while a sinister cardinal gains more after doing acts of great evil. The setting allows you to ask, why are these things happening? Why are certain people rewarded while others are punished? And that definitely leads to a lot more possibilities for a DM or a party than even a player might initially ponder or explore in other settings. For Eberron and the Inkwell Society, alignment isn't nearly the absolute that it is in other places. In fact, I pretty much am going to throw it out the window. I think lastly, one of the most important things, and then we'll kind of get a little bit more granular here, but one of the last things in there is that monsters may not necessarily be the bad guys. Maybe they're actually the good guys of any given story. Satine has a favorite module that she wrote and loves to run called Savage Nation, and it kind of reaches into the whole idea of what happens when the monsters are the ones in the moral high ground. What is the moral high ground? And how does that affect the other people around them? How does that affect the nations around them? And how does that encourage them and drive them forward as they progress through the storyline? There's a ton of pulp and noir themes that can be found within Eberron, and there's also a couple of very interesting things that you don't find in other settings, like Dragonmarked. dragon-marked houses that kind of have a monopoly over the economy, and quite a bit more. I'd say there's a common golden rule that exists in Eberron, though, and that is so that people who spend a lot of time in other settings don't necessarily feel out of place. And the golden rule for that is, if it exists in D&D, it has a place in Eberron. Now, that doesn't mean it does exist, but it means it can. So, to paraphrase from Keith Baker's website, it's vital to recognize that the statement isn't if it's in D&D, it's in Eberron. Rather, that it's if it's in D&D, it has a place in Eberron. So, if you love the Abil, which are bee people, there are many places that you could put them. They could have a lost hive somewhere in Zendrick. Think about Zendrick kind of like Chult, but minus the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs are actually on the main continent we're going to be hanging out on. If they're not there, they could be a product of the Morning. The Morning is actually the catastrophic event that settled the last war. We'll go into more detail on that in a little bit later. But essentially it destroyed an entire nation by some magical cause, and nobody's quite sure why. If you don't like Abil, you don't have to use them, but they're available to you. They aren't necessarily in any given place, but it's safe if you want to add them to your own campaign. This is a key statement in Eberron, which kind of gives it the whole kitchen sink idea, but it only has to be as much of a kitchen sink as you want it to be. For us, for the Inkwell Society, that us, it's my goal to have the world be as close to the representation of what you'll find in the materials as I can. Now, I could homebrew a whole bunch of stuff. I could put Tal'Dorei in some other random continent. I could have Athos, the setting of Dark Sun. You know, a hop, skip, and a jump through a portal if I wanted. But we're pretty much going to leave the setting as it is. That way, anybody that's thinking about maybe moving on to Eberron or any of these other places, or is even interested, is going to have a good idea of what that setting is based on just watching our show. From the start, Eberron was designed with a lot of inherent flexibility. Between the Morning, Kyber, which we'll get into as well, and Zendrick, all of these places are intentionally a little vague and allow for a DM to have a lot of flexibility in what they're doing. You can add almost anything you want to, and if you would like to check out a little bit more in-depth reading on those specific elements and you don't want to dive through all of the books for it, you can just check out keithbaker.com and go through his blog. There's a lot of stuff in there. I mine a lot of it. So that kind of brings us on to the next part. I'm sure a lot of you guys following our Twitter have noticed that we've been throwing around the word Noir a lot. Well, what exactly does that mean? What is that, and why Eberron for it? Fantasy is very often the struggle between good and evil. The players are heroes, and their cause is just. Or at least it's clear enough that if they go rushing headlong into any conflict, they're probably going to turn out to be acting in the best interest of everyone around and going to be applauded for their valor and their compassion. In a noir story, good and evil are vague and usually hidden behind different shades of gray. The protagonists are often flawed and scarred by their past mistakes. They'll be faced with a lot of difficult choices, and they might be haunted by the consequences that could come out of their actions while we play. They'll be faced with a lot of difficult choices, and they may be haunted, or their heroism may not necessarily be recognized. Their stories might not end well. Hearing all of this, one might ask why anyone really wants to play such a game, and I got a couple reasons. By far, some of the most interesting pieces of people, of their internal fiber, or even the characters for that matter, is really wrapped up in their flaws. It's wrapped up in the mistakes that they make. You can watch this all over our current film and TV situation, whether it's Breaking Bad or even Altered Carbon, where there's just plenty of negative things that the hero has done somewhere in the past life, and they're maybe seeking to atone from it, or maybe they're still running from it. But somewhere along that story, they're gonna have to be challenged with a couple of situations that put them in a moral conundrum. That's really what we tune in to see, is how exactly are they going to act when those things happen? What are we going to do? Because really that's what gaming does for us, is it helps us to explore the ideas of situations that we would either never find ourselves in, never put ourselves in, or we might clam up had we not experienced it in some other way. For me, a noir story can often feel more real than a heroic story might, simply because it's more relatable to us. Personally, I think that the turn is much greater when you come from somewhere flawed, somewhere jaded. And your rise to power, or at least your rise to overcome that, which may not necessarily end in a great way, is what I'm tuning in for. It's what I want to see. So, in Eberron, we can explore those kind of themes in a campaign setting like this. It's built with that in mind. There are no incarnate gods to serve as absolute embodiments of pure good and evil. The war and its ongoing impact provides opportunities to explore the best and the worst impulses of people and of humanity. The nations, we have 5 direct ones that are considered to be the 5 nations of Galifar. Those nations are complex, and they are designed with ambiguity. There's a noble queen who wants to restart the war, even though she wasn't really winning, but she sees political gain somewhere. There's an evil usurper, one of the primary proponents of peace, who doesn't mind employing just about any tactic to keep the peace. Despite having the military advantage, just doesn't seem to want to do it anymore. An evil guy whose heart's not in the fighting? What does that mean? What does that mean for a player? It's interesting that we have something like this that allows us to explore these themes together. Usually in a noir setting, a film, television, you end up having mostly one protagonist. But with player buy-in, with everybody on the same page, we can actually explore that both individually and as a party. We can have those same arguments that a person might have internally, but we can have those out loud together. And as a group, we can explore, well, what happens down the good road or the bad road. Whichever one the PCs take is where we're going to go. I'm not going to be really railroading anybody into anything, and the story really just runs. The bad guys aren't going to wait around for them, and they're also gonna have their own initiative. They're gonna have their own things that are important to them. And if the players can't figure out what that is, if they can't put the clues together, perhaps they don't actually get to solve the big mystery. Maybe they're not special. Maybe they don't even make level 1. So what's pulp? Well, anybody that's done any amount of study into pulp knows that that's basically a term that was used for taking some of the old, the first recycled paper, mashing it up. It gave your comics or your really trashy sci-fi stories in the 50s gave them something to be written on, because nobody wants to waste good paper on iffy stories. But we have a lot of fun with those. That's actually what most of our video games are done in the vein of. And if you look at, like, Indiana Jones, that's a pulp story. Now, what is pulp noir? It's kind of that same thing. Maybe there are some tropes. Maybe there are some elements that seem to be a little hokey. Or maybe you're just reading at face value like the bad guy wants you to, and you don't actually see what's happening underneath. So for us, when we talk about noir, we're talking about really the shades of gray that lead to the black. Pulp tends to be an epic adventure. It tends to be larger than life and filled with a lot of dramatic action. Bold heroes that face dastardly villains. They have a purpose, the players do, the heroes do. And it's clear and evident. It's kind of like what we were talking about in Eberron. Eberron can actually hit that spectrum, right? Because if it's in D&D, it has a place in Eberron. But that's the stuff that happens when the players really start to gain momentum and start to gain levels. When the Emerald Claw, which is a kind of a religious cult, maybe sect, of what more or less turns out to be assassins for most part. Zealot assassins at that. You can be pretty reasonably sure that they're up to no good, and you probably do want to stop them at any cost. What you really have to wrestle with is how far you're willing to let things escalate, and what kind of alternatives you can seek out to stop them before something crazy really does happen. A big thing between those two is noir is really about your intrinsic rewards, whereas pulp is very much about the extrinsic stuff. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, think about extrinsic as kind of the way that D&D is played now. Getting gold, getting levels, the way a party comes together, the way a character grows, the way that clues are a reward as they lead you on to the next step of the story. Those very interesting moments, I feel like, are almost more rewarding in certain areas than picking up a +5 sword or some ancient artifact. When you think about that, you're probably used to a lot of that stuff having effect on your character in a mechanical way. We're going to be exploring what kind of effect these rewards have on them in a personal way, and it's really something that you kind of have to have your friends for. Either that or you have to have pretty much total player buy-in. Everybody sitting down at the table has to know that that's what we're moving towards. Now, Eberron isn't built to negate any of those things, but it's really built to accommodate those, either pulp or noir, and sometimes both, based on how you as the DM or the players want to engage in the world. But too many slips in the wrong direction could lead the story to become unbalanced. When I said no safety net earlier, I'd like to dive in a little bit more on that. Something like the Death Curse, something we're all pretty recently aware of if we've been playing D&D. The Death Curse is kind of like the idea of no safety net. But in Eberron, that really means that there's no casual resurrection, no reincarnation, no revivification. They're mostly going to be beyond Eberron's wide, low magic scope. It's possible, sure, but it's going to cost a lot for anybody, not just the players that need to maybe do a favor in order to convince a cleric to raise a character, or an incredible amount of wealth, which is another fun thing about this setting that we'll get into towards the end. But it's really important that it's also very taxing on the individual. So regardless of what happens, it's a dire cost, and one that you may never actually run into, even at higher levels. You, as the players, are actually the important people, and so if you're a cleric and you get Revivify, or you're a cleric and you get Resurrection, you're a big deal, and people know who you are. Maybe not on like an apostle level, but then again, maybe that's exactly what it is. The lack of incarnate gods means that your faith actually matters, right? In Faerun, you know they're there. It's kind of whatever. It's a fact. So your faith in those gods is meaningless. You can, on occasion touch them. You can see their power. You hear tales of them. But in Eberron, we get to explore what does faith actually mean. It's kind of a lot more like here in our world. It means that choosing your religion is a lot less like choosing a sports team and a lot more like having conviction in the principles of what that religion is. In order to have gods walking around, you're really going to be stripping a lot of the mystery out of the world, which is something that Eberron loves to keep, that ambiguity, that mystery. But when a god's, just hanging out at the local tavern, you can kind of go ask him anything. You almost don't even need to be powerful enough to cast Commune, right? But imagine if you're a cleric and you get to Commune and you're actually the first person that's spoken to a god, or at least even attempted to find one and converse. Maybe the last person to do that was a couple hundred years ago, or the only person currently doing it sits in Flame Keep. The other side of that is, like I've said before, the gods aren't going to come save you. So, I like that kind of a setting. For your players, what it really means is that it's important for them to think about why they have faith, and if they do at all. It really keeps the story centralized on them as individuals instead of the whole grander scheme of a world and a cosmos that they are just little specks in. Now, that kind of sounds a little backwards from what I was saying earlier, right? Like, they're not special. Well, the PCs are special. They just have to earn it. As opposed to in Faerun, where you're gonna be powerful, but you're still not gonna be special. Because, like Syndrome said, when everyone's super, no one is. Thank you, Disney. So, the last war, the Morning, what does that mean for the future of Eberron? Well, I explained the last war already as kind of being World War I. And it's kind of jumbling it up a little bit to say that it's not World War II, in the sense that the Morning is essentially a magic atomic bomb that leveled an entire nation. You can easily read more about that. But the critical point of the last war is that nobody actually won. Nobody knows why the Morning happened. There was no airship that this big magic bomb fell out of. This just happened, and it's a mystery. There are different theories, of course, but the main concern, the big fear, is that during the war they were flinging around magic a little too haphazardly. Even if it's low-level magic, that's still a lot of magic users. Maybe they're the ones that caused it just by being irresponsible. Sound a little bit like global warming? Would that level a nation? Or an entire civilization? Or a world? They kind of don't want to find out. So, the tenuous peace that's happening right now after the last war is due to this big magical atomic bomb, but also the fear that it could just happen again at any moment. The other thing that we find in Eberron that is completely different from any other setting is the idea of prophetic marks. There's a prophecy. It's called the Dragon Prophecy. And this is where we get our dragon marks from. Dragon marks are kind of like tattoos or sigils that show up almost, no, not randomly, but kinda, because you don't know, even if you're in a bloodline that normally gets them, you don't know if you are going to get them. The Draconic Prophecy is like a tapestry of signs and and signifiers that allow those with the eyes to see it to predict the future, or at least that's what they say. And the they is typically a dragon. There are prophetic marks that work as an indication of an individual that will rise to significant power, basically due to the prophecy or to help fulfill it. Think maybe like a butterfly effect. Though how significant their part in playing... Bad kitty. Though how significant their part in the new prophecy in the future, that kind of depends, right? Like I said, butterfly effect. And that's something that you get to discover either as a player or as a GM or as a party with the Dragon Mark character in it. The Dragon Marks are going to be the most prevalent, but there certainly are other prophetic marks around the world, and they're there to discover. Dragon Marks are essentially sigils that appear on the skin, and they reflect a magical talent possessed by the bearer of the mark. There are 13 true Dragon Marks. These are called true marks because they typically have a consistent appearance. They look the same, they have the same range of abilities, and they progress in the same manner. Just because you get one doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way. It could grow to be bigger. In fact, it could take over the majority of your body. Though that comes with more power, obviously, but it also makes you a visible threat to anybody around you. So you kind of got to leverage that with when you walk into a room. We've got a little bit of stuff to cover there on maybe one of our characters being a dragon-marked inhabitant of Eberron, and seeing how the world around him interacts with him differently than how they interact with some of the other characters. So the marks, what's really interesting about dragon marks specifically is that they typically only appear on a certain bloodline, unless they're an aberrant mark. An aberrant dragon mark is typically an entirely different color, where regular dragon marks are usually bluish green, kind of have that almost neon look. Aberrant marks are red. They look painful, and usually are, but they also carry a greater destructive power. Sometimes this happens by two people from different dragon mark houses getting married, having offspring, and then those bloodlines not mixing so well. That could get passed on for generations or lay dormant, even for 100, 200 years. So a character who may not even know they're in a dragon marked house or in that bloodline might become a foundling later on. So what are dragon marked houses? Because obviously if we're talking about bloodlines, that means that there's a lot of them. And why wouldn't they make a collective? Why wouldn't they try to capitalize on this power that they have? Well, that's exactly what they did. And so there's a certain amount of respect that individuals with dragon marks actually get. And they are usually held a little bit above common people. They are referred to as Lord and Lady, even if their family isn't really all that wealthy outside of being a part of the dragon marked house. That sounds a little odd because you're like, well, their surname is the same as every dragon marked house, like Cannith, right? So they'd be Lay to Cannith, Lady Lay to Cannith. But they actually also have a bunch of other little families in there that are still in the same bloodline. Think about like your cousins and whatnot, but don't necessarily share the same last name. So when they're within the house, they do refer to each other with their last names. That would be something like Ruty Rutenberg to Cannith. Make sense? Outside the house, they're still going to be referred to as Ruty to Cannith. Lord, thank you. You can read a little bit more about that on page 10 of the Dragon Mark book if you feel so inclined. But the important thing to know about lords and ladies that are of Dragon Mark descent, as opposed to the actual aristocracy that inhabits Eberron, is that the Dragon Mark houses put a prefix in front of the house name. So instead of just being Cannith, and you heard me say Decannith, that's how all the dragon-marked houses are referred to outside of the house. So D, Cannith, is literally a lowercase d with an apostrophe in front of the name. For the nobles, you're going to be looking a little bit more in the... Let's do a little different noise. So for the aristocracy, the nobles of the land, they're signified in a slightly different way. It is still a prefix with an apostrophe, but it's the lowercase letters of I and R. That's called Ir. So, Lord Werner Ir Tahar. And typically, these aristocracy have some say on what goes on. They're not just landholders, but they're also perhaps a part of parliament. Something like that. I talked a little bit about dragons, and there's dragon-marked houses, but what happens, what's going on with dragons in this setting? How are they different than any other setting? Well, in Faerun, they're just kind of all strewn about. They're hyper-intelligent, they probably have some collective, but they're not necessarily... their culture and their society seems to be more selfish, right? More inward-focused on each individual dragon. Unless, of course, they're being commanded by Tiamat or something to fly in a big flight of dragons. Or Takesis calling all of the different colors of her flights to attack the world, right? So in Eberron, Arganessen is a continent that is marked on the map and basically is just like, here's dragons, don't go there. Because they have their own culture. They have all these things that they're doing. They're very old, they're powerful, and they're very intelligent. As a culture, they largely ignore all of the lesser races, the smaller people running about. And they do like to tuck hidden agents into other cities, other nations, other civilizations, usually waiting to see where new dragon marks appear, where they can study them from a distance or maybe even as a close mentor to one of your characters. Maybe they're there keeping tabs on how the prophecy is unfolding, if the dragon mark's getting any bigger, or if you've fulfilled what they think your prophecy or your purpose is in the prophecy, based on their interpretation of it. Overall, dragons kind of fill that role of ultimate power that a god would have, but they're pretty scarce. They're known to exist, but most people think of them like stories and legends. They're... you'll hear tales about them, but you won't necessarily know much about their deeds outside of the few that might make themselves known to people. Now, if you go to Arganes and you go looking for trouble, you're going to find it, as well as a bunch of barbarian tribes that are basically in the same mindset of kobolds, worshipping the dragons as if they were deities. And if they're the ultimate power, they're probably pretty close. So, what happens in an economy where your magic is technology? You can create an enterprise around it, you can make it stable, right? So, essentially, if arcane magic is science and it's reliable and repeatable, people can use it to make tools. Anything from like an ever-bright lantern to an airship. But part of the point is that when you treat it like science, you also need to give it the limitations of science, meaning that innovation should be something that's earned and usually at a very high cost, at a very dear consequence for what's made. Every day when we have a new advancement, there was a lot of man hours, a lot of money, and maybe some blood that went into that process of getting the science right. When I say low magic, wide magic, I've kind of touched on that briefly, but where Eberron differs a little bit is that the conflict that would normally happen between high and wide magic is that a place where powerful magic is part of everyday life, that doesn't necessarily mean it is high magic. It's just more widespread, right? But there are jobs that people have, and they can essentially perform what we know as cantrips in 5th edition, to go through and light the street lamps, or to guide a ship by giving it a little bit of extra gust with some wind. The streets are usually lit by that continual flame I'm talking about, and people can lock their doors with arcane lock. If you see magic up to 3rd level, that's actually something people are used to. But if you go 4th and 5th levels, now you're talking about the effects that are really only attained by people with dragon marks or by really impressive wizards. There's not a whole lot of them running around. It's any service that you're going to get there is going to be pretty rare and very expensive. You can raise the dead or you can purchase teleportation, but probably only in the largest cities, like Sharn, maybe. But anything above that is pretty much going to be remarkable in Eberron. It's kind of the thing where nobody takes the wish skill or the wish spell for granted, especially anybody that can actually get around to casting it. That's a big moneymaker right there, right? And there'll be very few people that ever could. Before I get into what the coin is, and I think this is very important because for the economics of Eberron, we really are going to put an emphasis on coppers as opposed to everyone has 1 billion gold, right? And you're just walking around with a couple of ton of gold in your pocket or in your extra dimensional spaces. Well, I'll read you a little bit about Sharn and or a little expert from the novel City of Towers, which is based in Sharn, that gives you a better idea about how coinage is going to work, and also how important being able to rub 2 coppers together actually is. So I'm going to take a real quick restroom break, and I will be back to have a little conversation with you about that. And that'll basically wrap up what we're going to do as it entails with me talking directly at you. After that, we'll do some Q&A. And anything that you guys are curious about, I'll answer. And beyond that, if it's something I don't know, which is possible, then I will seek out the answer from Keith and get back to you before we start the show. How about that? All right, so I'm Ruty, and this is Inkwell Society, and we're excited to get kicking down this Eberron campaign, and hope you're excited to join us on it too. See you in a few minutes. Let's talk about money. I feel like that was worth doing. I don't know. All right, so what are we talking about now? We're talking about the money of Eberron, really like the nuts and bolts of, well, actually, what does money mean in most other campaigns? I mean, it kind of means power, right? I mean, it does in real life. So in D&D, what do we translate that to? Usually like mechanical power, usually power that lets you level up, right? In old D&D, gold pieces were experience, so of course you killed every monster, smashed every jar in the hope that 1 extra experience was laying at the bottom of some lake. Why not? But as D&D evolved, and hopefully as we have as well, we can start to see that money is actually a story point, a plot point, not just some thing to gain for a mechanical benefit. So the primary purpose of gaining wealth is mostly to acquire equipment, usually, right? And to modify the balance for their level. Well, our characters are going to start at 0, so there's no real balance that they can strike with that. They're going to be underpowered to everything. It almost wouldn't matter how much money they had. The people in Eberron and Sharn, especially down in the lower, gritty, grungy areas that they're going to be frequenting the most, where they're residing, those are places where people are going to be very sparing with their wealth, where they may not find nice things, right? So largely divorcing wealth from the character's power allows wealth to serve its more traditional purposes. And that means like what do characters actually want? Not what do players want. They want levels, they want magic items, etc., etc. But what do your characters want? It really helps to take you out of that whole metagame experience. You could maybe spend your cash on fancy clothes. I can think of at least one character in our campaign with, we'll say, colorful hair, who is probably going to spend money on fancy clothes. We can reasonably assume that there could be somebody who takes religion seriously and tithes, or maybe gives that money to charity. We could also assume somebody's going to gamble it away, or drink it away, or, I don't know, buy property, heaven forbid, right? So really what wealth comes down to for us is going to be a new plot point, a new character moment where they're actually going to be trading their extrinsic rewards for more intrinsic rewards. Again, that's really what our Noir stuff is all about, right? So it's pretty exciting to get to play with the idea that you might give up the possibility of one day having a magical sword because, well, maybe the local urchin could really use, that copper crown a little bit more. Maybe a little more than you can. So, to read you that excerpt that I was talking about earlier, this one comes from the appendix of Keith's first Eberron novel called City of Towers. In the modern age, I got them laughing. In the modern age, merchants have begun to use letters of credit to handle large transactions, drawing on the reserves of the dwarvish banks of the Moor holds. But most day-to-day transactions are dealt with through the use of coins of precious metal. Once all the coins were minted under the authority of King Galifar. With the collapse of the Old Kingdom, each of the 5 nations began to mint its own currency, along with the more bankers. However, while designs printed on these coins may vary based on its source, each individual force has the same metals and the same weights. The denominations that were set forth in the days of Galifar maintain a simple standard for commerce across Corvair. The crown is made of copper, not a crown, a copper crown. A crown is made of copper, and traditionally depicts the crown of Galifar on one face. The crown is the lowest denomination of coin minted under the rule of Galifar, which spawned the saying, "In Galifar, even beggars have crowns." 10 crowns are worth 1 sovereign. A sovereign is made from silver and bears the face of a living or recent ruler. An unskilled laborer can expect to earn a sovereign for a day's work. 10 sovereigns are worth a gold Galifar. The Galifar, made from gold, bears the image of Galifar I, the founder of the Old Kingdom, and 10 gold pieces are worth 1 platinum dragon. Not a big one, just a little coin. The dragon bears the image of a dragon from a legend, and the value of it is worth 100 sovereigns. You kind of picking up the breakdown? There are a couple of other civilizations a couple of other coins that are used in different civilizations, such as the double crown of Braylon, which is worth 2 copper, because double crown. The silver throne of Kyrie, or Sire, however you want to pronounce the nation. Doesn't really matter, because that's the one that got blown up in the morning. But that one has a value of 5 sovereigns, so think of a silver throne as the $5 bill. And all of the major nations make use of the 4 basic coins described above. To summarize their values, 1,000 copper crowns would equal 100 silver sovereigns, would equal 10 golden Galifar, would equal 1 platinum dragon. All right, so we've got the basic concept, right? I'm done. I got tired of reading it, obviously, and had to start wiggling about. So the basic concept I think we've all grasped here is that the currency might vary from nation to nation, but it's essentially the same. It's the same metal, the same weight. It's all good. But the difference is when you start looking into some of those more eclectic nations. For instance, Droam has a really cool form of currency, bounty-marked teeth. That basically means that when you take prisoner a bounty, one of the outlaws in the area or something, you're gonna take a tooth out of their head, or at least be allowed to once you get back, and then they're gonna carve little insignia on it based on what that bounty was worth. I'm gonna go ahead and say that an ogre or a troll with larger teeth, especially like the tusk, is going to be worth a little bit more than, say, a halfling's, canine. There's also other pieces like they call in Zilargo, instead of silver, they call them zilver. Little funny things like that here and there that allow us to have a little bit of flavor in the world, but don't really modify the effects. And really a lot of that comes down to we didn't want to have this feeling of like, well, you have 300 of this, and it's only worth 80% here, so you're really only looking at like 240 of that. We didn't really want to have to play with that, and the creator, Keith, and all the D&D people thought it was a good idea to just keep it right across the bram. You don't really get that situation happening too often in some of the other settings, but that's also probably why everything has just been simplified to gold. Again, it kind of doesn't make sense, people walking around with tens of thousands and thousands of pieces of gold, which is supposed to be sturdy enough that, like, you can bite it or something. The way that Eberron kind of handles a lot of that stuff is once you start moving up into larger amounts, like the amounts that the Dragonmark houses might be trafficking, they start to issue banknotes. That way the dwarven banks in any of the given cities can still interchange that, or somebody can take your note and write you a receipt, basically, an exchange note, and that becomes what it's worth. But it's kind of like a traveler's check, right? So you might lose the banknote, and what are you going to do to replace that money, or what happens in that scenario? And there are some houses that are better at creating a failsafe for those things, and obviously forgery is a thing too. So the dwarves and the gnomes can work together in a lot of places to make sure that they're incentivizing each other appropriately, right? So normally a Dragonmark house might be at odds with another one, but if there's money to be made, they're going to be a lot more likely to work together. For the core books, and for our purposes, currency is obviously going to be very simple, and our party might find themselves scrounging about Droam. They're gonna want to find somebody to change out those teeth before they cross the border, because what noble wants to have any amount of teeth just clattering around in their change purse? So what are we going to do with that? What does that really mean? And like I said before, it really comes down to, why do the PCs need money? They'll be able to purchase magic items, that's a thing, but those magic items are very typically going to be something more common. If you take Xanathar's Guide to Everything, for instance, there's a lot of common magic items in there that have a lot of really nice utility effects, but don't necessarily affect the power level of a character. So that's really great. And that gets you a way that you can spend that coin to actually make your life more convenient. And that's really how magic is used, especially in Eberron. A +1 sword might be something of a masterwork that you have to order. Like, you have to really invest a good amount of money in, and it might be a gamble on whether or not that blacksmith can actually take care of that, can actually pay for, or can actually forge the item. Outside of that, you're looking at having a lot of scenarios where the magic items are basically just a sword that doesn't rust, or one that doesn't get dull. Sure, you could say, well, I'll just use prestidigitation for that, but what if you don't have it? Like I said, a lot of our players are going to be, and by a lot I mean all, are going to be level 0. They're going to feel what it's like to be peasants. They're going to know the fear of dying from the internal bleeding of being punched in the face. So when they're evaluating whether or not it's worth trying to take some teeth from an ogre, or whether or not they're going to try and cheat at a card game, that's going to be something that they have to weigh against the idea of being dragged out into an alley, beat, and literally left for dead. Especially if the amount that it would cost to get healed is 10 times what they would have won in any type of game. Especially, cheating and stuff. So they kind of have to measure the risk versus reward in almost every situation. Just like imposing on somebody else getting beat up in an alley might have some bad consequences for them, one way or the other. Maybe the person getting beat up is somebody important to them, or had a clue that they were supposed to pick up, but because they let the guy get beat up, now all of a sudden there's some gang that has this piece of paper. They have no idea what it does. They have no idea that it's got any type of relevance, but the party knows, and the party knows they lost it because of something like that. I know my players are watching right now, and so you guys are getting a little idea of how important the decisions you guys make as a group are going to be when affecting the story. So to kind of wrap up what happens with magic items, or the purchasing of magic items, the money that they have is going to be scarce, and what they do with it is going to have effects on the game. It may not be something that they can see right away, but I think that it's a lot more rewarding when you have something that isn't necessarily a short-term instant gratification type thing. Isn't it better if you have to, if you maybe tithe, but then later that priest is more apt to step in, more apt to help you out, or you give money to an urchin and later that urchin comes around and gives you a little bit of information that helps you avoid getting your butt kicked at some point. These are all fun little elements that we get to play with because money is important and scarce, and you're not necessarily just flinging it about at every tavern you go to trying to buy information from people. If you can't buy it, how are you actually going to go about getting it, right? What's going to give you the best avenue, the best return? And the final point kind of on that is I guess 2 more points that I'm going to touch on that before we go into questions. And so now's really the time that you want to do get in your questions so that Ryan can log them down and we can talk about them. But and if you want to do that, just do a little Ask Ryan in quotations or bold it or whatever you want to do. Hashtag it so that he can collect those. Now's the time. I'll go through these last couple of points and we'll do some Q&A. So looking at gold in the mountains, right? Those big those big sums that we're talking about. Maybe when you issue some sort of credit or a letter of credit or a banknote of sorts, there's also the inverse of that. Like, what if you're in debt to somebody, or if it's possible that maybe somebody that you want something from doesn't even deal with coins. They kind of refuse to handle them. That's kind of the place where a piece of paper or maybe some... just put something in the way of her egress point, and she won't be able to get up there, and she'll stop. That may be something... cats, right? Can't tell them what to do. All you can do is block their path for a little bit. Okay, so... somebody, may have something like a sheet of paper or some sort of thing that is going to give them going to work as a form of currency, maybe in the same way that our dollar bills do. But they're probably not going to be walking around with a wheelbarrow of coin because those people don't really want to handle that. It makes them a target to pirates or thugs or maybe even to... the person trying to sell their wife a nice dress. The other point there with magic items is that it shows you the existence of dragon marked houses having focus items, and these are items that help them channel their dragon marks to do pretty incredible things like create a teleportation circle or control an elemental or even a storm when they're on an airship. So those are things that if we have one of our dragon marked heirs, that's a thing that they're going to have to eventually budget for, way down the line. Hopefully, this campaign goes for the length. I would love to see these guys actually make a super high level. And, maybe some of them will die along the way, or maybe some of them will patter out as most campaigns go. Like, we are just playing standard D&D. But wouldn't it be awesome if this thing is actually a multi-year campaign where we get to see them grow from being literal peasants all the way up? The last point there is that when we're treating magic like science, it creates the idea that you can maybe manufacture a couple of magic items as that sort of a focus. And you might not buy a +1 shield from the same place that you get a bag of holding. Maybe you actually have to travel a long distance to get to the place that sells that. And even then, they probably only carry one, so you might get there and end up having to wait. Maybe they sell it just before you get there. But there might be other things that you see of interest in the meantime, or maybe thugs that come and mug you. Who knows? That's pretty much going to wrap up like what the basic differences of the setting are. And again, if you want to see like a pretty good recap of the 10 things to know, just check out the Eberron campaign setting booklet on the DM's Guild. And then if you want to go a little bit further in depth, like if you're really interested in running a campaign and you don't want to set it in Braylon, you want to set it in Karnath or in Undair, or even in the Lizard Principalities, you can get the Five Nations book or any of those other ones, and they usually have, like, what do you need to know? What are the top 5 things that every person from that nation knows? What are the top 5 things that every person from that dragon-marked house knows? And then they also have this really cool thing that I really like, where there's, like, a knowledge check thing. So at the beginning of the game, yeah, your character might be in the house, he might have some things like that, but depending on what his history check is, he might only know or remember the first little thing, but may not remember the grand history of, who actually founded the house, et cetera, et cetera. Little history lessons. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and hop it over to some questions. And what? Oh. So we'll go ahead and kick over to some questions there. Ryan.
Yeah, did also see your Slack under...
I see them. Under you?
Yes.
Yep. All right. Are we going to be using the Quaterminus of the Distant Plains? Not right now. They're level 0. If they get sucked into a plane, we're probably not going to see them again. But that doesn't mean that the effects of how close some of those other moons aren't going to have any impact on the manifest zones, right? For anybody who doesn't know what manifest zones are, you can look it up. I'm not going to spill it right now. I would rather my players either figure it out in game or do some research. But not bring that in. Don't meta on me. I already told you what'll happen. So, we'll obviously, the way the moons interact, the specific time of the calendar, what happens, is going to be important, but it's not necessarily going to be something that we're going to focus in on at such a low point, or such an early point in the campaign. Now, when they start reaching, we'll say, anything past, like, maybe 10th level, yeah, you might see things like that. There's quite a few planes, and there's quite a few things going on a lot of them. So we might as well explore what that looks like in how Eberron would approach the planes. From Ambience Invoker. What inspired you to have the group start at 0? Have you borrowed any mechanics or inspiration from systems other than 5e to make the fame feel lethal? I'm assuming that means to make the game feel lethal. Ryan. Never mind. So, I'm also, I wrote a little thing on factions and on suspicion, and I created mechanics that allow us to have a gauge, or at least allow me to have a gauge for what kind of impact the players are having on the factions around them, on gangs, on higher level syndicated crime, on the city watch, on different nobles and the dragon marked houses. I literally have like totem columns, and there's going to be, they won't know exactly when they're either creating good influence or bad influence, but that's definitely a thing that we're going to be playing with. And to some degree, like I looked at a lot of other game settings to kind of get a feeling for that, and I ended up having to make my own to really make the setting feel the way I wanted it to. But the inspiration for that level 0 thing really came down to I just want to make sure that we have we're playing a game that we don't really ever see played, and we're getting an experience that we don't really ever get. You know, I've been playing D&D for a while, and Satine's been playing it forever, and Satine's never started at 0. Not once in, like, basically the 20-something year love affair that she's had with D&D. She's never started that low. She's always had a class. She's always been somewhat powerful, and I think it's going to be really cool to see how they handle situations when they can't just drop a bomb on the enemy, right? What are some of... if you wanted to know some of the other games that I'm fond of that make me want to delve into the style that we're playing for Eberron, you know, first and foremost, it is the setting, because it's built for the Noir thing. Beyond that, I'm a huge fan of Dust City Outlaws, which we actually just got our Kickstarter copy, and we're going to be playing that as a group just for fun, right? I mean, we still have game nights, so we're still going to go play that for fun. It might actually be my birthday present to me. But that's one of my favorites because it really makes you stop and consider the different encounters that you're going through and what kind of things like gathering information can do to the overall outcome, to your success, or neglecting doing that. What happens then? Another one that I really like is Blades in the Dark, right? That was one of the ones that I looked at how factions worked, but it was too... I don't want to say like elementary, because it's a great game, that's how you work it, but it was just too broad. I don't know, there's only a couple of ticks in the wheel, and yeah, we could always just like make more ticks in the wheel, but I wanted something that was going to feel as though, you know, the players could actually have a grand influence on how the different factions, and especially the factions that are warring against each other, like how that's going to affect what's going on in the city, in their neighborhood, and maybe even in Braylon, and then eventually the world, right? When they get up higher level, they got to go through... are they going to end up starting the next last war? Will it be the last war? Do you just say last war instead of World War II? Things to consider. So, what do you got next? We got Bringer of Chaos. What are some of the books, movies, etc. that are inspiring the story that we're going to be telling? I'm a big fan of Fraggle Rock. I really love the idea that there are these little ecosystems. You think I'm kidding. I like the idea that there's these little ecosystems, and like all the places that like Traveling Matt goes to, for instance, or even the individual Fraggles, where they go and what their interactions are like, and sometimes how their very careless, selfish behavior comes back to haunt them. Beyond that, I mean, obviously, we're talking Noir, so we're talking about like the Maltese Falcon, we're talking about Chinatown. In recent stuff, you know, something we like to call it Neon Noir or Arcana Noir, and that stuff is like the new Altered Carbon or Blade Runner. Sin City is a great example of a modern-day noir, and they even went through the process of really using that hyper-stylized black and white and only putting... So this one comes from B. Dave Walters. He says, who's your favorite character in the group, and why is it Sig? I'm already sensing a little bit of jealousy. And that's fine, because jealousy is really just like the basis of your fears. And that is what our noir setting is meant to explore, really, is just your fear. So, let's find out why it's Sig. Or is it? Nick and Chicken! What sort of things do people in Eberron do for fun, seeing as everyone's poor? Alright, well, not everyone's poor. Just them. And the people they're hanging out with. If you look at the maps, like if you Google Sharn, you'll see some maps that have this top-down view where it kind of like shows you this almost horseshoe or an entire circle of different levels of Sharn. There's a bunch of other pictures that'll show you them kind of like as a cutout, like a sandwich stacked on top of it, on top of all of the pieces. And that's a really good way to look at that. And when you think about like the idea that we have a middle class, we have a lower class, and we have an upper class, theirs is just a little bit more fragmented. And while there's no real racism per se in Eberron, like even to the fact that like humans aren't from Corvair, which is the main continent. They actually came from a place called Sorlana, another continent, way blended for a really long time, and there's humans of all types of color everywhere. And if one was born by chance in like a manifest zone, they might be pink or golden or kind of give you that whole Azamar type feel, right? Maybe they've got gray, ashy skin, and they're not a shifter or they're not a changeling. That's something I didn't touch on, and I probably should have, is the different races that are different from Eberron. How did I miss that one, Keith? All right, so everyone isn't necessarily poor, but you know, even in the bottom of the Titanic, with the people that were basically going to be indentured servants wherever they went, you know, they're still going to have fun in the community of each other. They're going to find ways to make alcohol. Anybody that's in the military knows what I'm talking about if you've ever been deployed. Somebody in your unit likely got in a lot of trouble for burying fruit in order to make some hooch-type wine that was absolutely terrible. You know who I'm talking to. Those sort of things are like, you know, the things that you're gonna do for fun just because you're gonna be bored. And it's just like anybody else, you know? Maybe you read books, maybe you want to go hang out in the red light district in Sharn. Maybe you like to take in shows. You know, there's definitely going to be a whole level of Moulin Rouge, if you will, where we're hanging out. And beyond that, like fancy dinner parties, et cetera, et cetera. Like anything that you can really imagine for fun is probably going to be something players do. To touch on the races real fast before I answer those other two questions. The specialized races, there are 4 new specialized races that are in Eberron that you don't really find in other places. Eventually, D&D did, you know, move them over into other settings, but they really got their foundations in Eberron as being playable races. One of them being changelings, you know, so the ability to not necessarily change anything about your outfit or the equipment you're carrying, but way your hands, you know, make them appear a little longer, stuff like that. That's what that's the main basis of changelings. They're also, you know, very smart, very charismatic, and smooth talkers. They typically know a lot of languages, and obviously that's going to be something that works really well for a rogue type character. Second, shifters. I think I mentioned shifters a little bit before, but didn't really go into depth about that. And those are kind of in the same vein as like maybe a Dragonborn would be. Whereas They have some dragon lineage way back in their family, but it may have been hundreds of generations. Shifters just seem more feral. They typically have that desire to be outside, to not be domesticated, or maybe they have an anger issue, something like that. Beyond that, you have the typically psionic race of Kalishtar. They're usually very calm, very composed, and they also project this image of themselves that it's kind of like every nerd that has ever been clumsy or felt clumsy, Kalishtar are, just like anybody else, but you don't see it because they're actually kind of manipulating your mind in the slightest way as they're moving back and forth, so they always appear to be this almost ethereal, graceful creature, right? Really all they are is humans that have a connection with a spirit from a different moon. We were talking about some of those distant planes earlier. Well, one of those planes had its own little civil war, and some of those spirits found refuge in some of these humans. And the thing about the Kalishtar is they've all invited these spirits in. They basically have said, like, yes, we understand, and you asked, and sure, this is the thing we'll do. And they have their own kind of religion called the Path of Light, which is actually super interesting in its own way. There's also another side of humans that are very similar to the Kalishtar, where those spirits didn't ask, they just forced their way in and basically took over. And that's a whole continent of humans that really don't have any say over what they do because they're literally brainwashed. The final and the big one, in my opinion, the one that really gives Eberron its very uniqueness. Kalishtar is very close. Shifters are also right in there, but the Warforged. Warforged are actually basically sentient golems. They were a product of the last war. They were a eureka moment that House Cannith figured out kind of in the middling stages of the war. Obviously been working on it for a really long time. And from what it seems like, they basically stumbled upon it by chance. We were talking about magic being a part of all the great innovations. That's one that they were like, oh, look, we did this. And then they figured out how to make it reliable. And the reason for creating creatures like this is that now you don't necessarily have to have all of your people going off to fighting these wars. It essentially comes down to money, and instead of having just golems and robots go out, these Warforged can be trained slightly differently to take advantage of the battle tactics that any one of the given nations would have. There are some that are pretty handy with magic. It's more of a rarity. The majority of them are big, hulking brutes, big fighters. And the greatest kind of conundrum for any of the races in Eberron is really the idea of, like, what is somebody who is only bred for war, literally only made to be a warrior? What do you do when there's no war to fight? That's something, a lot of my friends from the military are very into Eberron because they feel a kinship with that feeling. You want to talk about something that, we were trained to do from basically our early adulthood, some of us even before that, that's a thing that we feel a direct kinship with, that lost feeling of a lack of identity, a lack of purpose, because our identity had been tied into basically just being the best fighter, the most efficient killing machine, or the most efficient logistics machine that we could possibly be, right? That doesn't mean that these golems, these Warforged, are like supercomputing masters. It means that they literally serve the function they are, and they can adapt and overcome different situations because of their sentience. They do have feelings. They're not really sure how to process them or to understand them, but they're working on it. And so with a Warforged in the group, you get to kind of explore that feeling. You're not just doing the robot the whole time you're playing that character. You're exploring what it is to be like man, right? What it is to be somebody with an infinite lifetime, because they, as far as we know, don't die unless you actually dismantle them. So as long as they keep routine maintenance up, they can practically live forever. Back to the questions. The biggest challenge in putting the adventure together. That comes from Blame Carla. The biggest the biggest challenge in this is making sure that the players are all buying in. When we sit down at a table, even if you do Adventures League stuff, you're looking at maybe having a quick session 0 where you're just like, oh, hey, I've got a couple of minutes. I'm going to tell you guys who I am, what kind of, what my GM style is like, and what you can kind of reasonably expect. Like, how consistent is this game going to be? Is it going to be really fanciful? Is everything going to be flinging magic around, or is it going to be a lower realism, or a very high realism kind of game? So that kind of a session 0 is really important in Eberron because, and especially with the Noir setting, because Eberron is so diverse. You can do just about anything you want to. You can have that high pulp swinging from vines and swinging from every chandelier, blowing things up with huge explosions behind you as you walk away all cool and stuff. That's totally available. But for this specific story, for this campaign, I wanted to weave something that had a lot of callbacks in it, a lot of things that the players can point to, things that happened early on in their careers and say, oh, wow, that happened because of this. And in order for that to really take hold, it means that you have to have the session 0, the conversation, and to clearly communicate with the players what they're getting themselves into. And you got to get the feedback from them to see if they're actually into it, right? Some of us are really lucky. We have a lot of friends that want to play D&D, and we can piecemeal together a group if we want. Maybe, your friends aren't into playing that type of hyper-realistic, you're going to get punched once or twice and die, or take death saving throws because somebody's kicking you while you're on the ground taunting your friend. Like, that's a thing that people really have to sign up for. We've definitely seen people die in a campaign and get super upset. And you kind of need to know going into it, even more so than with the Death Curse, where the possibility is there. This is a thing that could happen, and you got to sign up for it. What are the different ancestries in Eberron? That comes from Stabby Rogue Games. Could you clarify what you mean? Can you clarify what you mean by ancestries a bit? Do you mean a bunch of the different races, or do you mean the backgrounds of the same individual races in terms of like culture? Because we definitely will, and we'll do that during the campaign. I don't want to take too much of that away from the players because I want them to discover some of it. They, at present, part of our session 0 was making sure that they knew what pages to read in the given things that would be things with in the given books that would be stuff within their sphere of influence, so that they should have knowledge about the different neighborhoods of Sharn if they're from Sharn. Likewise, if they're from Karnath, they should have some idea of the area they're from, the path that got them to where they are, and maybe because Sharn is a massive military power, maybe they have some amount of information about how Karnathi operations work. That sort of thing. People from Onder might have a greater grasp, or at least a wider knowledge base of how the aristocracy there really likes to handle the politics of their court games, right? So ancestries, there's a whole rich feeling that comes back from the elves who were enslaved by the giants, were actually created in much the same way that the Warforged were kind of created, but these giants had sort of mastered life and death, and the dragons had actually created the giants and then taught them all they knew, and then receded away, watched from afar a little bit, just kind of seeing what happened, and actually set this whole thing in motion. And eventually, they had basically the Adam and Eve one rule of don't mess with blood magic. So after a couple of millennia, they got bored playing with all the magic the dragons gave them, and they started messing with blood magic. They created these elves that they essentially used as slaves and as fuel for their blood magic, and ended up bringing a moon down There's a magical artifact called the Moonbreaker. Those kind of crazy things. That all happened in Zindrik, which used to be the main continent. That used to be the seat of civilization before the elves revolted and fled. They had learned enough. The giants tried to keep them in relative illiteracy and in the dark for the most part. But the elves eventually started learning how to do the magic over hundreds or thousands of years, and eventually were able to rebel and left for Corvair. Corvair was actually pretty much ruled by the Dakani, which are goblins. You see, there's a lot here. There's a lot that we have to unfold, and there's some really interesting stuff in there. Like, for instance, in common, in the human tongue, goblin literally means any goblinoid race. So the ancestries of different goblins, whether they're bugbears or goblins like we think about them, or hobgoblins, they're all goblins. But in the goblin tongue, which is basically common for the goblinoids, they have slightly different modifiers before a word that similarly resembles the word goblin. That's stuff that I want the players to find out as they progress through whatever storyline they take. Carla asked about a big challenge for that. I like to have a bunch of storylines running at the same time, so my prep isn't just doing one storyline that I'm basically going to keep pushing them back to, like a lot of GMs like to do. I like to have a breadth of knowledge about the setting, about the system, that I can adjust based on what they feel like they want to do. So if they're on a current path to do a thing, and maybe they're not feeling it, they can just move over, and I know where the other storylines are in where the pace of those are. And so if they decide to switch, they can absolutely do that. Now, just dropping the basket over here, we'll probably have some sort of consequences down the line, even on that storyline, right? We're talking about the butterfly effect. So really making sure all of those are running is probably the biggest challenge beyond your session 0, which is actually a pretty big challenge for any campaign. Let's see. If we don't get a clarification from Stabby Rogue, did you hear my question to him?
Yes, you answered his question.
Okay, great. Matches Malone! What streamer would you like to see join you in the future for future shows? And why is it Matches? I feel like there's a trend happening here. Good job, D-Dave. You've earned some ire. But the actual question that he has, are there any weapons that would be in another setting regularly that may be outdated in Eberron? Well, yes and no. For instance, I wouldn't say necessarily outdated, but Eberron does have its own unique amount of weapons that are available that you don't necessarily find in any other setting. One is the dual scimitar, like a double scimitar. Imagine if Darth Maul had to wield something that wasn't a lightsaber. What would that look like? It would probably look like a scimitar that has a shared hilt. That's actually a very specific weapon of the Valinor elves. And it is something, they're something of they're kind of like wood elves, but they're on plains, so, they're very big into horse riding. Think of them like kind of the Dothraki from Game of Thrones. They have, instead of having those big Khopesh swords that the Dothraki have, their big favored weapon is basically 2 of those swords, snapped together. Another thing that is unique to Eberron, the Talenta Halflings, which are just north there in the Talenta Plains, just north of Valinor. They have something similar in the terms of culture, where those are tribal nomadic halflings. It kind of sounds a little odd when you think about it, especially because 2 of the dragon-marked houses are halflings. But this is their kind of like their ancestral lands, and that's where the dinosaurs roam. You ever heard of the expression of like a dinosaur riding a halfling? or like a halfling riding a dinosaur. Those things kind of became a little bit more prevalent in the other parts of D&D because of this setting. So those are things that are, I guess a dinosaur is kind of outdated and a thing that a halfling is using, but they also have, it's the only setting where they actually have their own two-handed weapon that is actually too awkward for somebody else to use. And their own kind of lance that is something that you would expect to see, not necessarily a spear, but heavier, that you might expect to see from early American cultures. The only other thing that I would say is like not really outdated, but just a lot more rare, is that in other settings of D&D we see a lot of magic wands. Like you can get a wand that just casts cantrips all day, or you can get a wand that casts a specific spell. Well, and then maybe recharges at dawn or something. In Eberron, because magic is so scarce, those kind of items are going to be really hard to come by, and they may have a very finite number of spells. The utility that they're important is the amount that those things are important may be reserved for very dire situations, and the amount of emphasis that an NPC or that a PC needs to put on maybe retrieving one of these items, hint, or whatnot, might actually be in their best interest to help. And then we still have the moral high ground or low ground of, if they do retrieve it, do they try and sell it? Do they keep it for themselves? Or do they do what they said they were going to do? And what are the consequences from any of those decisions? But yeah, I mean, we've got a whole list of streamers that, may make it on the show, Matches. But why is it B-Dave? B-Dave Walters has another question. What can you take from a level 0... What can you take from a level 0 penniless character? He says nothing. Nothing, I say. Challenge accepted, man. Sure, let's play that game. That is the game we're playing. We already talked about it. That was our session 0. All right, so unless anybody else has any more questions they want to pop in, we'll give it a couple seconds there. One of the things that I feel like is good for us to kind of circle back on for anybody that's interested in running this kind of a campaign, when we started our session 0s, and you did hear a plural there, we did like 3 of them. And when we play Dust City Outlaws, that'll essentially be a 4th one, because it's really going to help establish the tone together. But all they were allowed to come to their session 0s with were flaws, vices, and like their greatest failures. And sometimes like an embarrassing moment if they had one. But they weren't even allowed to come with like what race they wanted to be. Because a lot of that stuff we actually did together. You might think that's kind of lame, like that, to kind of select characters as a group, right? To do it all. Most people are usually going to say something along the lines of like, no, I want to be a Minotaur, and so I'm going to be a Minotaur, and I think I'm going to be like, a Minotaur bard, because moo. And that's a great way to go into most other settings. That's fun, right? But specifically because we're doing a noir game, and we're not even talking about like filling party roles, we're just talking about whatever their issues are, because again, every noir character has their own unique flaw, and we really don't want to have like 4 people that are all alcoholics, and 2 other people that, are mourning the death of their cat. Satine, you're about to lose one. Just kidding. We really wanted to make sure that everybody felt that they were unique. And that was the easiest way for us to establish what happens, or what keeps them special when they don't have a class, right? What keeps them interesting when they don't have a class to fall back on. And I felt like it was important for us to start that story with what happens when they don't even have a race to fall back on. They can't even rely on racial tropes for things. They literally have to create these characters from the ether of their mind, and then how that story is progressing, then we start to sprinkle in some backstory. We start to sprinkle in a background for them, and then we start to talk about, you know, races that are going to, or ancestries that are going to work well in that sphere. We don't want any overlap. We want everybody to feel unique. We want you guys to have somebody that can be interesting. Because the only way that I feel like, you know, two characters that have almost everything in common is going to be twins that say everything together at the exact same time. That's a really hard feat to pull off live, and I also feel like I would get really annoyed with that really quickly. I would probably have to kill one of them and make them start a new character anyway. So to avoid that and any heartache, we, you know, went ahead and just did our session 0 from the ground floor and built it up. And, you know, I've played D&D with all of these people before. They're all my friends. I love them all. And I really wanted to, well, except he did. But I really wanted to make sure that we had a rapport going into it, that the characters knew each other and had that feeling of connectivity, even if their characters had yet to meet. Which, when we start the campaign, they won't know each other. Not all of them, anyway. One or two of them will know other individual ones, and they might know each other peripherally through different contacts. Anybody who was on Patreon might have helped contribute to some of those contacts, and you might have a little bit of inside knowledge about when some of them are going to overlap, right? But we'll see exactly how that's going to work out when the campaign moves forward, and that actually gave me a whole lot to start preparing the stories, the different timelines moving forward. And I've got things that are plotted out all the way down the line. Let's see, what else we got? Dark Room Demons! You know I love dinosaurs. How could I know that, Dark Room Demons? How do they fit into the economy and ecosystem of the continent? For the most part, halflings are the only ones that actually really have any domain over them. They can be used in other places, but they don't really. You can see I'm looking over here. Maybe there's a reason. There we go. So, halflings are really the only ones that have any amount of influence, and that doesn't mean that they can't be domesticated by other people, or even that halflings don't domesticate them and sell them as beasts of burdens or whatnot. But that kind of goes against the tradition of it. Like, they believe in the spirits of it. In fact, the halflings of the Talenta Plains have spirit masks, and they believe that when they bond with a dinosaur, so that kind of like tosses out of the window the idea that they're going to train it and then give it away. But when they bond with it, they actually believe they have like a link, and when they ride it into battle, it almost acts as like kit. You know, they can whistle for it and it comes running. Or they can think a certain thought, and the dinosaur can already adjust to what they're planning to do in battle. And that can go all the way up to like a T-Rex, you know, or up to a pterodactyl type dinosaur. There are dinosaurs in other parts of the world. I guess technically a dragon is a semi-close, smarter relative, maybe. Maybe that's even a storyline that we can play with down the line, is that what happened to the dinosaurs to make them all just dumb dragons? Did they piss off their dragon teacher so they didn't get to go to school anymore? Who knows? But the economy and the ecosystem of the continent, they're pretty much stuck in the Talenta Plains for the most part, as far as Corvair goes. You won't necessarily see them trouncing around in different cities, but maybe somebody will have one as an exotic pet, like a mogwai. Nick and Chicken. Rudy, what do you want for your birthday? I want to be able to spend some time with my friends, and I'd like to be able to get them all the information that they have, because I'm still, they've all turned in their backstory stuff, and I need to clean up their contacts and whatnot, and so those kind of things, and various other paperwork. That would be a wonderful birthday present for me. So that. But outside of that, I'm a simple man. I just like to play games and have fun with my friends. So maybe getting to play at any given convention with any of you. Maybe playing a game that you run at some point. Any number of things would be great. Anything else? Any more questions out there? No? Cool. All right, well, with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up a little bit. We had hoped to give you guys a little sneak preview of the intro, but like all good things, you're going to wait for it, like this campaign. You've got one more week, so we will look forward to seeing you March 21st at 7 p.m. right here on twitch.tv/MazeArcana. If this sounds intriguing to you, if this sounds like something that you would be happy to support, there's a sub button. It's like right up there. Beyond that, we have Patreon, right? And if maybe you're a little short on cash, but you've already got an Amazon Prime account, you can go ahead and log in you can sync your Twitch and your Amazon, and you can sign up there, and it's free. You just have to remember to renew it. Outside of that, we're excited to explore this with you guys. We are excited to have a campaign that you guys can be involved in, that you guys can enjoy alongside of us. You know, that you can have one of them, or your DM, that you're cheering for, you know, in any given encounter. And maybe you guys get to experience some of the conundrums that they do, and maybe you get to do it through them. Or, you know, maybe you get to come on the show. Who knows? But there are different ways that you can still be involved, and that you can still be around. Like, obviously, they're going to freak out if you make fan art of them. It's just a known thing that they're going to just be like, what? Somebody cares that much? You know, if you want to have influence over some of those NPCs and those contacts, there's a really easy way to do that. Our Patreon members just got to do a whole slew of it with me. And, you know, that's in a way kind of me in there teaching about how I go about doing those things in my campaign setting. Or, you know, when we talk about mechanics, I'll go through and show you how I design a class. And we got a lot of that stuff coming up. There's some new supplements that we're going to be releasing in the near future, some new little game things that are going to be awesome. And Patreon and Twitch subscribers are going to be the first people to get to be involved in that. But outside of that, I'm sure you guys have seen the Discord link popping up in chat constantly. Jump in there. You know, be a part of the community. We play video games together. We do maze plays on Tuesdays. We have a growing family here that we want you to be a part of. Our biggest, most, the thing that we categorize pretty much over everything else is community, and an inclusive community at that. So you aren't excluded here. You are actually going to be a part of what we're doing, and you're going to be looked at, you know, the same as anywhere else. Well, I guess I would hope better than anywhere else, because our community is great. The people that are in this chat room, the people that are supporting us on Patreon, the people that are in our Discord are amazing, and they're very welcoming. So hopefully you got a little taste of that tonight, and you want to come back for some more. So outside of that, we have Sirens of the Realms, which will be starting towards the end of March as well. I know we've got a lot of people that enjoyed those incredible songs that those girls put together, and Satine's very hypnotic DM style. And we'll also be doing a little treat where we have other DMs come and do one-shots on Sundays. That'll all be starting real soon. And if you like playing video games, you want to come play some games with us, Maze Plays on Tuesdays at noon. So we will... We'll be releasing more information about it, more times and all that stuff as we go, and keep an eye out for clips and promos and special giveaways like really awesome dice bags from Cognitive Merchant. If you don't know who they are, you should look them up. As always, we would like to extend a great big thank you to Dungeons & Dragons for giving us this awesome game to play and being consistent in trying to make it a better game. They didn't just stop when they put it out once. TSR started that tradition of going, above and beyond to make the game better every iteration. And Wizards of the Coast kept that alive and has given us probably the most elegant game design we've had yet for the system. Thank you to Black Magic for these awesome cameras that we get to use that make us look so nice and shiny. And for the other sponsors like Sirenscape that help us remain entertaining when there's dead silence, or would be. We look forward to all the new partnerships that we are just a hair away from being able to announce. And from the little PGs that want to run around and get... oh, too many cats! There's too many cats! They just miss me and they want to come play. So with that, I'm going to go play with the cats. And I'll see you guys in a week. And then also there's, Maze Plays on Tuesdays. So we will see you guys soon. I'm Rudy, and you can find me at Ruty Woot on all the social medias, and here on twitch.tv/MazeArcana and twitch.tv/D&D. See you guys soon.